The stars over the Cadian gate were dying, not all at once, nor with the brilliance of supernovae, but in the slow, choking way of a flame starved of air. Their light grew dimmer with each passing century, their edges blurred as though reality itself no longer knew how to shape them. Beyond, the eye of terror bled into the void, like an open wound in the skin of the universe. A churning vortex of crimson clouds and black lightning, whispering promises to those foolish enough to listen. Cadia stood between that nightmare and the rest of the galaxy. It had stood for 10,000 years, a fortress world forged from war itself, where children learned to fire a laser gun before they could read, and where the walls of its castles were built from the bones of its defenders. Yet now, the bastion that had held back the horrors of the Imperium since the days of the heresy stood on the edge of an ending it could neither escape nor deny. And it is here, my friends, in the shadow of dying suns and amidst the roar of oncoming war, that our story begins. But before we speak of battles and betrayals, of heroes who fall and enemies who endure, let me say this: we truly love and care for you. Your presence here, among the ruins of worlds and the echoes of legends, is what keeps these stories alive. So before we begin the telling, I must ask, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The night on Cadia was never truly dark. The warp light from the eye cast everything in shifting shades of red and gold, making the mountains look as though they bled molten fire, and the rivers ran with the glow of half-forgotten dawns. From the high walls of Casa Vortigern, Lord Castellan Ursarkari Creed surveyed the horizon with a soldier's eye. Not for beauty, but for danger. It was quiet tonight. Too quiet. The Vox reports spoke of increasing warp surges along the periphery, of sensor ghosts in the asteroid belts, of fleet formations disappearing without trace. The men on the wall joked nervously, pretending it was just another night in the long war. But Creed knew better. A lifetime on Cadia had taught him to recognize the difference between a routine patrol and the last breath before a killing strike. He lit a low cigar, the smoke curling in the freezing air. It was a small rebellion, a rare indulgence in a life of discipline, but tonight felt like a night for final comforts. General Kell, his trusted aide and friend, approached from behind, his boots ringing softly against the metal decking. "They're saying the enemy fleet's massing in the Bellis Corona sector," Kell said, voice low. Creed exhaled smoke through his nose. "They're saying a lot of things. What they're not saying is who's leading it." Kell's silence told him everything. There was only one commander whose name could turn the steel hearts of Cadians cold: Ezekiel Abaddon, the War Master, the despoiler, the traitor son of Horus, whose black crusades had battered Cadia's walls time and again, but never broken them, until now. Creed's mind moved like a battle map. For 10,000 years, the Black Legion had thrown themselves at Cadia's gates and failed. If Abaddon was coming again, it would not be with the same blunt assault. No, this would be different. This would be decisive. "Have the Caster Lords been summoned?" Creed asked. "Hours ago," Kell replied. "They'll meet at dawn." Dawn. The word felt strange in his mouth. The sun would rise, but it would rise on a world that was already doomed. Creed did not believe in prophecy, but he understood inevitability. Cadia could fall, and if it did, the Imperium would never be the same. From far beyond the walls, a deep rumble shook the air, like the growl of a predator circling unseen. The soldiers stiffened, scanning the night. Somewhere in the black sky, the first drops of blood were falling. Creed allowed himself a final moment of stillness, his eyes fixed on the shimmering horizon where real space and the warp fought over the same ground. He thought of the generations who had lived and died here, never knowing anything but the duty to hold. He thought of the unbroken oath of Cadia. The gate must never fall. But as he turned away from the wall, he could not shake the thought that this oath was about to be broken, not by weakness, but by inevitability. And somewhere out there, in the bleeding skies beyond the eye, the War Master was already watching. The night would not be quiet for much longer. The void beyond the Eye of Terror was not silent. It whispered, a chorus of voices from 1,000 damned worlds, carried on the currents of the warp like ash on the wind. In that eternal storm, time had no meaning. Empires rose and crumbled within the span of a heartbeat, and the dreams of mortals rotted into nightmares. For most, to look into that abyss was to lose oneself. But Ezekiel Abaddon had looked into it for 10,000 years, and never blinked. Aboard the vengeful spirit, the War Master of Chaos stood before the viewing ports, his towering frame a silhouette against the seething glow of the warp. Lightning forked across the void, painting his armor in flashes of gold and black, the talon of Horus resting at his side like a sleeping predator. Around him, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the faint taste of blood, the warp's breath upon the ship's hull. Behind him knelt his inner circle, champions, sorcerers, and warlords of the Black Legion, each bound to him by oath, fear, and ambition. They did not speak unless spoken to. Here, in the War Master's presence, words were as dangerous as blades. "You have all felt it," Abaddon said at last, his voice deep and measured, like a glacier grinding mountains to dust. The Imperium weakens. Their armies are scattered, their will fractured. The corpse on the throne sits rotting, and the light of his Imperium gutters like a dying torch no one dared interrupt. He turned from the viewport, his gaze sweeping the chamber. His eyes, the color of molten brass, lingered on each of them in turn, not seeking approval, but daring them to defy him. For 10 millennia, Cadia has defied us. For 10 millennia, the lapdogs of the Corpse Emperor have stood at the gate. We have broken them, bled them, ground their bones into dust, and still they stand. There was a pause. "And so," he continued, a cruel smile curving his lips, "we will not break them this time. We will erase them." The chamber stirred, warriors shifting in their armor. Some grinned behind their helms, others clenched gauntleted fists in anticipation. The thought of Cadia, that defiant jewel of imperial defenses, reduced to rubble and ash, stirred something primal in them all. Abaddon stepped forward, the deck plates trembling faintly under the weight of his warplate. "I have gathered weapons the likes of which this galaxy has not seen since the Great Heresy," he said. "The Blackstone fortresses are mine to command. They will tear the veil between realities and let the warp itself devour Cadia. And when it is gone, the Imperium will have no shield, no wall, no hope." He stopped before one of his lieutenants, a hulking champion named Skorvash, the Bloodforged, and placed a clawed hand on his pauldron. The gesture was as much a warning as it was a mark of favor. "You will lead the first spearhead," Abaddon said. "Make them feel the bite before they see the blade." Skorvash bowed low. "It will be done, War Master." At the back of the chamber, a figure stepped forward, a sorcerer of the Black Legion, his armor adorned with glyphs that pulsed faintly with the heartbeat of the warp. "Lord Abaddon," the sorcerer said, his voice a hiss. "The omens speak of resistance. A golden figure walks the walls of Cadia. The light of faith burns there. Still, Abaddon's smile did not fade, but his eyes grew colder. He knew well of whom the sorcerer spoke, a saint reborn, a symbol that the Imperium clung to in its darkest hours. He did not fear her. Symbols could be broken. Let them have their light, he said. It will make the darkness sweeter. He turned back toward the viewing ports. The warp storms churned like the breath of some vast beast, and somewhere deep within, Abaddon thought he heard the faint echo of a laugh. His father's laugh, long dead, yet alive in memory. For a moment, the War Master's gaze unfocused. He saw the bridge of the vengeful spirit as it had been 10,000 years ago, Horus Lupercal standing at its center, the galaxy at his feet. Abaddon had stood at his right hand then, believing in the dream of a new order. That dream had died on the walls of the Imperial Palace, cut down by the Emperor's blade. Now there was only vengeance. "Prepare the fleet," Abaddon commanded, voice snapping, the air like a whip. "Signal the warbands. Ready the planet killer. We strike not as raiders, but as executioners." A low murmur of approval rolled through the chamber. In the depths of the eye, engines roared to life, weapons awoke from their slumber, and the banners of the Black Legion unfurled in the storm winds. Cadia's last dawn was coming, and Abaddon the Despoiler would be there to watch it burn. The wind over Casa Vortigern cut like glass. It carried with it the smell of promethium, the tang of burnt metal, and something older, the faint, bitter scent of blood soaked into the stone over centuries of sieges. From the battlements, Cadia's mountains stretched away in jagged lines, their shadows warped by the ever-present glow of the Eye of Terror. Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed stood at the parapet, hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on the horizon. In the distance, the auroras above the eye twisted unnaturally, their colors shifting in ways that made mortal eyes ache. He had watched them his entire life, yet tonight they seemed closer, as if the warp storms themselves were leaning toward Cadia in anticipation. General Kell approached, his boots clicking against the frost-slick stone. "Reports from Casa Partox," he said without preamble. "Skirmishes along the western ridgeline. Enemy scouts, renegade Astartes, Creed didn't turn. Black Legion?" Kell hesitated. "Confirmed." The word carried weight. For Cadians, Black Legion did not mean just another warband of traitors. It meant Abaddon. It meant the War Master himself was here, and that meant war on a scale beyond anything Cadia had faced in living memory. A silence stretched between them. Down in the streets, the night patrols moved like clockwork, their boots hammering the frozen ground in perfect unison. Cadia's discipline was its pride, but Creed knew even perfect soldiers could be broken. "Bring the caster lords to Vortigern," Creed said at last. "We meet before dawn." Kell nodded, but there was something in his posture, a weight that had nothing to do with the cold. "There's another matter. Inquisitor Greyfax has arrived." Creed's brow furrowed. He'd worked with Inquisitors before, necessary allies, dangerous guests. "Has she given her reason?" "She says she's here to ensure there's no weakness in the command structure. No heresy." Kell's tone carried a hint of irritation. Creed allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Which means she's here to watch me." When Greyfax entered the command chamber, she moved like a blade, precise, sharp, without wasted motion. Her armor gleamed even in the dim light, and her eyes were colder than the Cadian winter. "Lord Castellan," she said by way of greeting, her voice level but carrying the weight of unspoken judgment. "Inquisitor." Creed inclined his head slightly, enough to acknowledge her rank, but not enough to concede authority. I trust your journey from the segmentum obscurus was uneventful. Nothing in this sector is uneventful anymore, she replied. I will be blunt. We have credible intelligence that Abaddon intends to make Cadia his primary objective. His fleet is already on the move. Creed took a slow breath. Then you already know what that means. I do, she said. It means Cadia cannot hold without outside intervention, and it means we must be prepared to make difficult choices. Her gaze lingered on him, searching for weakness. Creed met it without flinching. The only choice is to hold. Cadia falls. The Imperium's spine breaks. We are the wall. We don't decide whether we stand, we simply do. A faint curve of her lips. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one to unsettle him. We'll see. When she left, Kell stepped closer. She'll be trouble. They all are, Creed muttered. But sometimes trouble's what you need. Night deepened. The Casa Lords arrived in 2s and 3s, each bringing reports from their sectors. Most were grim. Enemy fleet movements in the outer system, cult activity in the lower Casas, a surge in warp anomalies that had fried half the Auspex arrays in Castra Murak. Creed listened, his mind weaving the threads together. The picture they painted was one of encirclement, not yet complete, but tightening. If he acted now, he could consolidate the defenses, and by weeks, maybe months. But doing so would mean abandoning 3 Casas along the outer ridge. Tens of thousands of Cadians lived there. Kell caught his eye across the table. He didn't need to speak, the question was already there. Creed closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice was steady. We pull them back, he said. Evacuate Kasser Varn, Kasser Jerick, and Kasser Halvik. Demolish the bridges. Burn the supplies. Nothing for the enemy to use. There was no outrage, no protest. The Kasser Lords were soldiers. They understood necessity. But in the silence that followed, Creed felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. These were his people. Every order he gave now was a choice of who lived and who died. Later, alone in his quarters, Creed poured himself a measure of Amasek and stood by the window. The eye glowed like an ember on the horizon, and in its light, he imagined he saw the faint outline of a great shadow moving. The first drops of blood had been spilled. The war had already begun. The banners of the Imperium once flew over 1,000,000 worlds, their golden aquila a symbol of unity and divine order. But on Terra, in the shadow of the Imperial Palace, the first fractures in that sacred unity had begun to form, not in the minds of enemies, but in the hearts of the Emperor's own sons. The seed of doubt had not been sown in a single day, nor by a single voice. It had been cultivated over decades, whispered in shadows, fed by wounded pride, and nurtured by those who found the Emperor's vision too rigid for their own ambitions. The first to feel its weight were not common men, but the demigod Primarchs themselves, each a titan of war, yet each a creature of passions, fears, and dreams. Among them, Lorgar stood apart. The word-bearer had always sought faith where the Emperor had offered only reason. His legions built cathedrals in conquered worlds, their sermons turning conquests into crusades of worship. And yet, for this devotion, Lorgar had been rebuked. His cities burned, his temples toppled, his faith dismissed as weakness. That wound had never healed. It festered in him like a slow infection, turning reverence into resentment. And when the whispers came, honeyed words promising truths the Emperor had denied, Lorgar listened. It began subtly, a gathering of brothers in private halls, their words spoken in half-truths and guarded tones. Horus, the War Master himself, was the first to draw many into his orbit. not with threats, but with a vision of a future where they, the Primarchs, would shape the destiny of the galaxy, not serve as tools to a father who would not share his throne. Some came eagerly, others cautiously, but all who gathered at Horus's side felt the same pull, the belief that the Emperor's truth was incomplete, that the galaxy was vaster and stranger than the Imperial truth allowed. The first open defiance did not come in war, but in worship. Lorgar's chaplains began to spread a new doctrine, one not of the Emperor's sole divinity, but of gods older and greater. They spoke of powers beyond the veil of reality, of beings who could offer strength and immortality beyond even a Primarch's gift. The Emperor's agents noticed. Silent arrests were made, sermons banned, and chaplains vanished into the dungeons of the palace. But each act of suppression only deepened the bitterness. On Calth, Ultramarines found themselves in open conflict with word-bearers, brothers turning on brothers, not for territory, but for belief. What began as skirmishes escalated into massacres. And yet, even as the blood flowed, the greater betrayal remained hidden from most of the Imperium. In secret, Horus and his allies swore oaths, not to the Emperor, but to the four powers of the warp. They did not call it surrender, they called it freedom. It was in these days that terror itself began to feel the tremors of treachery. Loyalist fleets found themselves cut off from supply lines, communications faltered, and astropathic messages carried strange distortions, as if unseen voices whispered through the void. In the Imperial Palace, the Emperor knew. He had always known that the warp was not merely a tool for travel, but a sea of predators, gods that fed on thought, emotion, and ambition. He had built the Imperial truth to starve them of belief, to deny them worship, and now his sons had opened the floodgates. But the Emperor was not a man to plead. He summoned his custodians, his generals, and his most trusted advisors. His words were not poetic. They were commands, precise, cold, and without hesitation. There would be no more tolerance for deviation, no more leniency for those who strayed, for in the shadows of the galaxy, the great betrayal had begun. And as the first fires of rebellion lit the stars, the dream of a united Imperium, the dream that had once seemed unbreakable, began to crack. The storm had been building for days, not in the skies above Terra, but in the hearts of those who stood upon her walls. The void shields flickered like dying embers, each failure met with a rumble that shook the bones of the fortress. The enemy had drawn close enough that the defenders could see the glint of their armor through the smoke, hear the low chant of their war hymns. It was not a siege anymore. It was the tightening of a noose. The Emperor's armies had held for weeks, repelling wave after wave, but every victory was paid for in blood. The legions were thinning, and the wounded were piled high in the apothecarian halls. Even the custodians, paragons of immortal vigilance, bore cracks in their golden plate and exhaustion in their movements. At dawn, the bombardment began again. This time, it did not stop. For 12 straight hours, the skies rained molten ruin. The air itself burned, the outer battlements melting into slag. The defenders sheltered behind what cover they could find, but no wall was high enough, no trench deep enough to hide from the storm. When the guns finally fell silent, the enemy came. They came not as a horde, but as a tide of steel and hate. Traitor Astartes led the charge, their corrupted warplate screaming with demonic voices. Behind them, mortal soldiers swarmed, driven by fanatical devotion to the War Master. The ground shook beneath the weight of their advance. On the battlements, Captain Ardentus of the 7th Legion roared his orders. Imperial fists lined the walls, bolt guns spitting fire, cutting down ranks of the foe. But for every traitor slain, 2 more climbed the breach. The first wall fell before the day was out, the second followed by nightfall. It was then that the enemy's war machines came into view, towering engines of murder, their cannons roaring as they tore apart bastions and towers alike. Each impact sent shockwaves through the Imperial lines, scattering defenders like leaves in a hurricane. By the third day, the last of the outer walls lay in ruin. Rubble choked the streets, and the cries of the dying echoed through the night. The defenders withdrew to the inner bulwarks, their eyes hollow, their spirits heavy. The Emperor's messengers carried the news to the Imperial palace. The enemy had breached the city. The outer defences were gone. From here onward, the war would not be fought on ramparts and trenches. It would be fought in the streets, in the halls, and in the blood-soaked corridors of humanity's last bastion. The siege was no longer a distant horror. It had arrived, and it would not leave until all was ash and silence. The fall of the outer walls had not ended the fighting. It had merely moved it inward into the arteries of terror herself. The avenues of the Imperial city, once the shining pride of humanity's golden age, became killing grounds. Every street was a trench, every plaza a killing field. The enemy poured in through the shattered gates, their banners fluttering against the smoke-choked sky. The traitor legions advanced like a tide, and behind them came the mortal rabble. Heretics, mercenaries, and slaves pressed into service, all driven by the promise of victory or the fear of their masters. The Imperial defenders were forced into brutal, close-quarter warfare. Bolt guns and las rifles gave way to chainswords, power mauls, and bayonets. The air was thick with the screams of the dying and the stench of burning flesh. Blood ran in the gutters, pooling beneath the fallen. On the Avenue of Spires, the 7th Legion made their stand. Imperial fists locked shields, forming an unbreakable wall of ceramite. Their commander, Sigismund himself, led from the front, his blade flashing in the smoke. Every swing cut down another foe, but the press of the enemy was relentless. Elsewhere, the custodian guard fought with inhuman precision. Their guardian spears reaped traitors like wheat, their golden armor glowing in the gloom. Yet even these demigods bled, their numbers shrinking with every hour. The traitors showed no mercy. Heavy artillery tore apart entire districts, reducing them to rubble. Buildings became fortresses for snipers, then tombs when the walls collapsed under bombardment. Civilians who had not fled were caught between the two armies, some taken as shields, others cut down without thought. By the third day of fighting in the streets, the Imperial defenders had begun to yield ground, not because they lacked courage, but because there were too few of them left to hold the miles of cityscape. The enemy pushed ever closer to the walls of the Imperial palace. Amidst the chaos, a single truth became clear. The city itself was dying. Its marble halls were blackened by fire, its monuments shattered, its skies filled with ash. Terror, cradle of mankind, was being unmade before the eyes of her defenders. As night fell, the Emperor's banners still flew above the palace. But for the first time since the siege began, the traitors were close enough to see them clearly. And they swore that before another dawn, those banners would burn. The final bastion loomed before the enemy. The walls of the Imperial Palace, the greatest fortress ever constructed by human hands. Its adamantine gates were tall enough to shadow cathedrals, its walls thick enough to withstand the fury of suns. For centuries, these defenses had stood unconquered. Now they trembled beneath the fury of the traitor hosts. The traitors came in waves. First, the bombardment, earthshaker cannons, siege mortars, and hellish warp-powered artillery pounding the walls without pause. The thunder was constant, shaking the very bedrock of terror. Each blast chipped away at the palace's armor, and with each hour the cracks grew wider. Then came the infantry, endless ranks of heretic Astartes marching in lockstep, their armor daubed in the blasphemous colors of the War Master's rebellion. Among them strode demons, their forms flickering between nightmare and reality, drawn to the slaughter like carrion to a corpse. The very air warped and screamed around them. The defenders met them with a wall of fire. Imperial fists manned the battlements, bolters roaring in disciplined bursts. Heavy weapon emplacements turned the killing ground into a charnel pit. Macro batteries belched flame, ripping apart siege engines in clouds of shrapnel. Above, the skies were a black cauldron of dogfights as loyalist aircraft clashed with corrupted flyers. Sigismund, now bloodied from days without rest, commanded the outer defense lines personally. His voice, carried over Vox, was cold and certain. They will not take these gates while I draw breath. If I fall, hold still. If you fall, hold still. We Are the Wall hours became a blur of violence. The traitors breached the first curtain wall, only to be driven back by a countercharge of custodians, whose gold-plated armor was now streaked with soot and gore. Every meter of ground was bought with oceans of blood. The enemy deployed their engines of hell. Towering titans, their silhouettes blotting out the light, strode forward with thunderous steps. Their weapons unleashed devastation on a scale beyond comprehension. Whole battlements were vaporized, defenders reduced to ash in the blink of an eye. Against them, the loyalist god machines rose in answer, and the plains before the palace became a war of giants. But the true horror was not in the Titans. It was in the realization that for every assault repelled, another came immediately after. The traitors did not tire, and their numbers seemed inexhaustible. By nightfall, the gates still stood, but the outer fortifications were a ruin. The loyalists were being pushed inward, their defensive lines folding under the sheer mass of the iron tide. As the Emperor's standard was illuminated in the darkness, casting its golden glow over the battlefield, the traitors raised a single cry that rolled across the plains like thunder. Terror will fall. And for the first time, some defenders wondered if they were right. The dawn that followed was not a sunrise. It was an inferno. The skies above the imperial palace burned with the light of thousands of fires. The air choked with the smoke of burning men, machines, and dreams. Terror's heavens wept ash. The outer defenses were gone. In the night, the enemy had surged forward with a final, relentless push. Siege engines dragged to the front lines in the dark had torn great wounds in the bastions. Warp fire, summoned by the traitor sorcerers, had melted gates that had stood for centuries. When the walls cracked, they did not crumble with a sound. They screamed. Now the traitors were inside. The grand outer courtyards of the imperial palace, once a place of processions and ceremony, became killing grounds. The once pristine marble floors were slick with blood, littered with the dead of both sides. Statuary of ancient heroes lay shattered under tank treads. Sigismund fought at the forefront, black sword flashing, cutting down any who dared approach the inner gates. His armor was battered, his movements slower than they had been at the siege's start, but his will was unbroken. Around him, the Templars fought in silence, their oaths binding them tighter than any chain. The custodians were everywhere, golden blurs amid the carnage. They moved like gods among mortals, their halberds cleaving traitor marines in half with single strikes. But even they could not be everywhere at once. and for every heretic slain, 3 more stepped forward. The noise was endless, the roar of bolters, the scream of artillery, the bellowing of demons, and beneath it all, the deep, terrible chant of the traitor legions, praising their dark gods with every kill. By midday, the traitors had seized several of the palace's grand halls. These spaces, with their towering pillars and high vaults, became arenas of slaughter. Defenders barricaded themselves behind makeshift cover, turning every corner into a trap, every staircase into a fortress. But the enemy pressed on, heedless of their own losses. In one such hall, a Titan's plasma blast tore through the ceiling, sending a rain of stone and gold down upon the combatants. Whole squads were crushed in an instant. When the dust cleared, the survivors kept fighting, as though nothing had happened. Dawn himself was seen in the thick of it, his voice calm over the vox as he repositioned his forces, sealing off corridors, collapsing sections of the palace to deny the enemy entry. He fought as a commander and a warrior both, his power armor scarred, but his eyes as cold and certain as iron. But despite all efforts, the enemy's momentum was unstoppable. By the day's end, the first of the inner gates, those that guarded the sanctum approaches, had been reached. The loyalists were now fighting not to hold territory, but to buy hours. In the flickering light of burning halls, men whispered the truth they dared not speak aloud. The walls were gone, the gates were breached, and the War Master's forces now walked the halls of the Emperor's palace. The siege was no longer at the gates. The siege was inside. The halls beyond the breached walls were not meant for war. They had been built for ceremony, for the parades of heroes, for the solemn processions of saints, for the triumphs of the Imperium's golden days. Their floors were marble, their ceilings were star-vaulted mosaics depicting the Emperor's victories across the stars. Now they were corridors of blood. Every archway became a choke point, every column a barricade. The defenders, Astartes, custodians, sisters of silence, and mortal soldiery fought side by side, their ranks thinning with every passing minute. Each engagement was closer than the last, until the war became a brutal melee of chainswords, power fists, and blades dulled by endless use. The sound was deafening. Bolter fire echoed like thunder trapped indoors, mixed with the scream of demon weapons striking ceramite. The air was thick with the stench of promethium, ozone, and burned flesh, and beneath it all, a terrible rhythm, the steady pounding of the enemy's advance, step after step, hall after hall. At the foremost of these defences stood Rogel Dawn. His voice was a constant presence on the Voxnet, directing the dwindling forces, sealing off corridors, collapsing sections of the palace to slow the War Master's advance. His tone was controlled, unshaken, yet each order came faster, more urgent, as the battle crept ever closer to the throne. Sigismund fought in the Hall of Triumph, his Black Templars holding their ground in a fight that had no retreat. Each time a wave of traitors fell, another followed, screaming their blasphemies to the dark gods. His armor was torn, his sword arm heavy, but his strikes remained true. He no longer counted the dead. There was no point. The custodians made their stand in the grand processional, the massive central avenue leading toward the Eternity Gate. They fought like lions before the carcass of a dying pride, each determined to take as many enemies into death with them as possible. Even they, genetically perfected warriors of the Emperor, were beginning to fall. For every golden giant that fell, the enemy pressed harder, sensing the weakness. Above them, the skies were not skies at all, only smoke and fire, lit by the baleful glare of the Eye of Terror bleeding through reality itself. Demons poured from the rents in the air, phasing into the very halls of the palace, bypassing fortifications entirely. Where they appeared, reality warped, floors rippling like liquid, banners turning to flesh, statues screaming as they melted into abominations. In the antechamber of the throne, Malcador the Sigillite stood in quiet vigil. He did not look to the battle, nor to the defenders fighting for every second. He looked inward, to the hidden paths of the warp, to the currents that even now dragged the Emperor toward his final confrontation. His face was calm, but his knuckles were white upon his staff. He knew the cost that would soon be paid. By nightfall, the Eternity Gate itself came under assault. The greatest of the Imperial Palace's defenses, it was a mountain of steel and gold, its adamantium doors taller than a titan. Before it, thousands of loyalists formed a living wall, knowing that if the gate fell, the inner sanctum and the Emperor himself would be within reach of the War Master's blade. The fighting there was unlike any other battle of the siege. Titans fired point blank into the oncoming horde. Aircraft screamed down the narrow avenues, unleashing missiles into the traitor ranks before pulling up just short of palace walls. The ground shook with the fury of the clash. Still, the gate shuddered under the blows of the enemy's siege engines. Demon Primarchs strode forward, their voices echoing through the halls, calling out challenges to their loyalist brothers. The traitor legions pressed closer, step by step, fueled by promises of victory whispered to them in the warp. Somewhere in the midst of that carnage, a whisper passed among the defenders. The War Master is here. And with that, every man, woman, and transhuman warrior knew. The endgame had begun. The battle had reached the heart of the palace. The War Master's forces flooded through shattered gates and sundered walls, their banners defiled, their war cries drowning out the thunder of artillery. The defenders had been pushed back step by bloody step until the fight now raged through the marble halls and sanctified chambers where once the Emperor's vision of unity had been planned. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, stood alone in the War Master's path. His golden hair was streaked with dust and gore, his once pristine armor cracked and blackened from days of ceaseless war. The angel's wings, though tattered, still blazed like symbols of defiance in the darkness of the siege. Horus waited for him. The War Master's throne room aboard the Vengeful Spirit was a cathedral of blasphemy. The deck was warped with demonic runes, the air thick with the reek of burned offerings to the dark gods. The moment Sanguinius stepped inside, the great doors sealed shut behind him. He knew the trap had been sprung, but he did not falter. Horus, no longer the brother he had once known, rose from his throne. His eyes were pits of molten hatred, his voice a mixture of the man he had been and the god thing he had become. "You should not have come, brother." Sanguinius' reply was quiet, resolute. "I could not do otherwise." They met in a clash of titans. Swords rang, each strike shaking the deck. Sanguinius moved with the grace of a master duelist, his blade a streak of silver light. Horus countered with brute force, each blow carrying the weight of the warp itself. The fight was more than steel. It was will against will, conviction against corruption. For moments, it seemed as though the angel might prevail, his blade striking deep, his fury undimmed. But Horus was the chosen of the dark gods now, and their power flowed through him like a storm. The breaking point came when Sanguinius, battered and bleeding, refused to yield. Horus's gauntlet closed around his brother's throat, lifting him from the ground. His voice was a roar of rage and sorrow intertwined. "Why do you resist what you cannot stop?" Sanguinius spat blood and met his brother's gaze. "Because someone must." The final blow shattered the silence. With one terrible strike, Horus broke the angel's body. Sanguinius fell, his wings folding around him like a shroud. The light faded from his eyes, but not before he saw, in that last instant, a flicker of doubt in the War Master's gaze. When the Emperor would later face Horus, that doubt would matter. But for now, the palace was one angel poorer, and the night seemed darker for it. The defenders felt his death like a wound in their souls. Across the blood-soaked halls, the blood angels roared in grief, their sorrow igniting into a berserker rage. The siege did not pause. It could not pause. But in that moment, the war claimed one of its greatest sons, and Horus, for all his power, did not feel triumph. Only the cold weight of WW. The death of Sanguinius was not the end. It was the tolling of the penultimate bell, the signal that the final hour had come. Deep within the walls of the Imperial Palace, the Astronomicon flickered. Warp storms churned across the galaxy, the Emperor's great beacon faltering as the War Master's fleet blotted out the skies of terror. The palace shook with the fury of the siege, but all noise and chaos seemed to fade when the Emperor himself stepped into the halls that led to the War Master's flagship. He had not moved from the Golden Throne for years. His power had been spent holding back the tides of the warp, shielding humanity from annihilation. Now, at last, he rose, not as a distant god figure, but as a warrior king bearing the full majesty of his wrath. His armor was ancient, chased with gold and symbols from the Unification Wars. In his hand was the master-crafted sword that had slain gods and humbled Xeno's kings. The Emperor spoke only once to his companions, Rogel Dawn, Malkador the Sigillite, and the warriors who had fought through hell itself to reach this moment. This is between Horus and I, none else. With that, he vanished in a flash of golden light. The vengeful spirit was a nightmare made manifest. Its corridors were no longer mere steel. They pulsed like living flesh, walls weeping ichor, shadows twisting into leering shapes. Time and distance warped. A single hallway seemed to stretch into infinity. The Emperor strode through, unbent, his will burning away the illusions of the warp. At the heart of the ship, the War Master awaited. Horus stood upon a dais, clad in blackened Terminator plate, adorned with trophies from 1,000 conquered worlds. His eyes glowed with unholy fire, and his voice was a thunderclap of mockery. You came at last, Father. Too late to save your precious son. Too late to save your dream. The Emperor's reply was quiet, but it cut deeper than any blade. I came to end this. They clashed. The first exchange shattered the air, warp lightning and psychic fire tearing through the chamber. Horus struck with the fury of all four ruinous powers, each blow a fragment of a god's will. The Emperor met him with pure psychic brilliance, a blade of light that could unmake the very atoms of its target. Around them, reality cracked. Demons screamed from rifts that opened and closed in the blink of an eye. Time stuttered, moments replaying themselves in loops of violence. Horus taunted as they fought, his words barbs aimed at the Emperor's heart. Look what your sons became. You built them to be perfect, but they were never more than weapons. I am what you made me. The Emperor's face was unreadable, but his strikes grew harder, faster. Still, he hesitated. This was his favored son, the first among Primarchs, the one he had once trusted above all others, and Horus knew it. It was that hesitation that almost proved fatal. With a feint born of 1,000 victories, Horus struck deep, his talon tearing through the Emperor's armor and spilling golden blood across the dais. The War Master pressed the attack, forcing his father to his knees. Then Horus made his mistake. Through a broken viewport, a lone Imperial guardsman stumbled into the chamber, a mortal, fragile as a candle in the warp-born storm. Horus turned, and with a gesture, he obliterated the man, flaying his soul from his body in an act of pure, needless cruelty. The Emperor saw it, and something in him changed. The hesitation vanished. The next moments were legend. The Emperor rose, his form blazing with a light that burned away all shadow. Horus struck again, but this time the blow was caught, stopped, and turned. The Emperor's sword became a spear of impossible radiance, piercing through the War Master's defenses. Horus screamed, not in pain, but in realization. The gods who had raised him could not save him now. The Emperor's psychic might overwhelm the protections of the dark gods, unraveling their gifts, burning away their corruption. "You were my greatest son," the Emperor said, voice breaking even as he delivered the killing stroke. "I loved you still." With that, he unleashed his full power. Horus was annihilated, not just in body, but in soul. Nothing of him remained for the warp to reclaim. The victory was hollow. The Emperor collapsed, his body broken beyond repair. Rogel Dawn and the survivors found him moments later, cradling his shattered form. His voice was weak, but his command was clear. He must be placed upon the golden throne, not to rule, but to endure. For if he faltered, humanity would be lost to the warp. And so, the Emperor was entombed in his eternal vigil, a god in all but truth, keeping the beacon alight at the cost of unending agony. The siege of terror was over. The dream of the Imperium was dead. Only its shadow remained. The walls of the inner palace trembled as the siege reached its final, ruinous stage. The golden throne loomed in the heart of the sanctum, its vast machinery humming like the breath of a sleeping god. Here, in this place where the air shimmered with psychic force, the fate of mankind teetered on a blade's edge. The Emperor stood before his captains and closest servants, his golden armor darkened with battle scars, his face carved from will and sorrow. For the first time since the war began, even the custodians knelt in the presence of the master of mankind, not out of ritual, but in reverence to what they knew would be his final march. Malcador the Sigillite lingered at the Emperor's side, his aged face pale, the weight of millennia pressing upon his frail form. They had spoken in private before the assembly. Whatever was decided in those moments was a burden they now both carried. "My sons," the Emperor began, his voice rolling like distant thunder, "the walls will fall. The traitors will come for me. That is their desire, and so I will meet them." Murmurs rose from the gathered warriors, but he silenced them with a single glance. "I do not go to save myself," he continued. "I go to end this war. The galaxy burns because of Horus, because of the lies whispered into his soul. If he is not stopped, humanity is lost. If I must sacrifice myself upon the altar of victory, then so be it. But my sacrifice will mean nothing if the Imperium dies with me." He turned his gaze to Malcador. "You will sit the throne in my absence. You will hold the gate between reality and the abyss until the end. Should I fall, you will keep the fires burning for as long as your body endures." Malcador bowed, though his eyes betrayed the knowledge of what such a task would cost him. To the custodians, he gave a different command: "Guard the palace until your last breath. No enemy is to set foot in these halls while life still lingers in your veins." To Rogel Dawn, who stood grim and silent at the edge of the assembly, the Emperor said, "Fortify the walls, hold the ground, and do not come for me. If you see my standard fall, you will know the war is won or lost." A heavy silence followed. The warriors of the Imperium, demigods and mortals alike, knew what was being asked of them. They also knew it was a command they would obey without hesitation, no matter the cost. When the orders were given, the Emperor descended from the dais. He walked among his warriors, placing a hand upon the shoulders of those who had followed him since the birth of the Great Crusade. To each he offered a final word, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a charge to carry into the ages. At last, he turned toward the gates of the Sanctum Imperialis. The shadows of the corridor swallowed his golden form, and for a fleeting moment he seemed less a god and more a man. Yet it was as a man that he walked to his destiny, one who bore the weight of all creation upon his shoulders. The final battle awaited. The teleportarium chamber blazed with golden light as the Emperor, Sanguinius, and a chosen cadre of custodians and imperial fists prepared for the most dangerous strike in human history. The air hummed with psychic tension, the warp pressing close, eager to claim all within. Beyond these walls, the siege of terror raged like a wounded beast. But here, in this moment, all eyes were fixed on the single objective, the War Master's life. Horus had lowered the shields of the vengeful spirit, an act too deliberate to be chance. The Emperor knew it was a challenge, a baited trap set by the son he had once called his most trusted. But time was the one resource they no longer possessed. If Horus was not struck down now, the palace would fall before dawn. With a nod, the Emperor signaled the activation. In a surge of blinding light, the strike force was hurled across the gulf of space, their bodies ripped from terror and flung into the corrupted heart of the traitor flagship. They materialized into a nightmare. The vengeful spirit's corridors had been warped beyond recognition, twisted into a living labyrinth of flesh-metal walls and screaming shadows. The air was thick with the stench of death, ozone, and something far fouler, the psychic taint of chaos itself. Custodians formed a protective ring around the Emperor as they advanced. Bolters roared, power blades sang, and the golden warriors carved a path through hordes of demon-possessed traitors. Every step was a battle, every breath a struggle against the oppressive will of the dark gods. In the vanguard, Sanguinius moved like a comet of vengeance, his blade cleaving through monstrosities too horrific for mortal eyes. Yet even the angel could feel the pull of the warp here, his wings heavy, his heartbeat quickened by a sense of something waiting. After what felt like hours within the shifting corridors, they reached a vast hall where the air shimmered with raw psychic energy. The War Master's throne room lay ahead. The Emperor placed a hand on Sanguinius's shoulder. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. The angel stepped forward, alone. The doors opened, and Sanguinius vanished within. What passed between him and Horus is a tale written in blood and grief. Few will ever know the exact truth. But moments later, a roar echoed through the vengeful spirit, a cry of triumph and malice entwined. When the Emperor entered, Sanguinius lay dead at the War Master's feet, his broken body a testament to courage unmatched. Horus stood over him, his armor blackened and spiked, his eyes burning with a light that was no longer his own. "So, Father," Horus said, his voice layered with something inhuman, "you've come to die." The Emperor did not answer with words, but with his power. Lightning and flame erupted as the two titans clashed. The deck plates screamed under the force of their blows, the very ship groaning as if in agony. Each strike was a meeting of godlike will and raw destruction. Horus wielding the full backing of the Chaos Pantheon, the Emperor wielding the psychic might of mankind's hope. Horus struck first, his talon ripping through the Emperor's armor. psychic venom flooding the wound. The Emperor countered, his sword blazing, slicing deep into the War Master's corrupted flesh. Blood, black and steaming, splattered across the floor. The battle raged across the throne room, each blow shattering marble pillars and sending shockwaves through the warp itself. Around them, visions of possible futures flickered, galaxies burning, mankind enslaved, or humanity ascendant in a golden age never to be. Horus laughed, driving the Emperor back. "You made me, and now I am more than you ever dreamed. The gods have shown me the truth. You are the jailer of humanity, not its savior." In that moment, the Emperor saw the truth. Horus was gone. The son he loved was dead, consumed entirely by the Four. What stood before him was a champion of chaos wearing his son's face. The Emperor's heart broke, but his resolve hardened. This could only end one way. Gathering his full psychic might, he unleashed a blast that shook the ship to its core, stripping flesh from bone, unraveling warp-forged armor. Horus screamed, not in pain, but in rage. He lunged, his talon aimed for the Emperor's heart. The Emperor caught his arm, their wills locking in a final contest. The room around them dissolved into raw warp storm, the material world falling away until only two figures remained in the void, father and son, locked in eternal opposition. The Emperor whispered, almost mournfully, "I will not let you take them." With a final surge of power, he obliterated Horus utterly. The War Master's body was reduced to ash and spirit, annihilated so completely that not even the dark gods could reclaim him. The Emperor collapsed beside Sanguinius, his body broken beyond mortal repair. He had won, but at a cost beyond measure. The Hall of Eternity, deep within the Imperial Palace, had once been a chamber of triumph. Its golden pillars and vast mosaic floor were built to host the victories of the Great Crusade, where the Emperor's generals and statesmen gathered to shape the fate of the galaxy. Now, it was a place of shadows and hushed voices, its glory dimmed by the thunder of the siege outside. The last council had been called. Every surviving commander of the loyalist cause stood beneath the flickering lumen lights, their armor scarred, their faces drawn. The air was heavy with exhaustion and the unspoken truth that this might be their final meeting. Rogel Dawn presided, a towering figure in yellow armor dulled by grime and blood. His voice carried the weight of inevitability. The outer defenses are gone. The traitors have breached the sanctum wall in 3 places. Every hour we hold is an hour purchased with lives we will not get back. We must decide where we bleed next. The Primarch's words were met with silence, then with grim reports. Malcador the Sigillite, pale and gaunt, spoke of the dwindling reserves, millions of militia already dead, the Imperial army in tatters, the legions fractured. Constantin Valdor reported the custodians' losses, their golden ranks now a shadow of what they had been. Arguments broke out. Some demanded a final push to reclaim lost ground. Others urged retreat to the innermost sanctuaries. No one dared suggest surrender, for such a word had no meaning here. Malcador, ever the strategist, outlined the only plan left: draw the enemy deeper into killing zones, into the very heart of the palace itself. It was a strategy of desperation, not victory. "We no longer fight for triumph," he said quietly, "but for time." Outside, the sounds of the siege drew closer, a deep, rhythmic pounding as the enemy's artillery shook the very foundations of the palace. Even here, in the Hall of Eternity, the walls seemed to vibrate with the impact. When the council adjourned, there was no formal dismissal, no grand speeches. Each commander simply turned and walked away, returning to the defense of their assigned walls. They all knew they might never see each other again. Malcador lingered last. Standing alone in the vast hall, he looked up at the golden ceiling, now cracked and blackened with smoke stains. He closed his eyes, as if committing the sight to memory. Then he turned and left, his staff tapping against the marble, its echo swallowed by the distant roar of war. The last council had ended. The final defense had begun. The Lion's Gate had been the pride of the imperial palace, a fortress within a fortress, its colossal adamantium doors and cyclopean bastions meant to withstand the fury of the galaxy itself. For weeks, it had done just that. But now, after endless bombardment, it was failing. The day began with an unnatural silence. The traitors' guns, which had pounded the gate without pause, went quiet. Loyalist sentries exchanged uneasy glances. Rogel Dawn, standing upon the parapets, understood the meaning instantly. This was no reprieve. This was the moment before the storm. Then it came. A single, world-shaking impact struck the Lion's Gate, a blast so powerful it seemed to tear the air apart. The shockwave hurled men from the walls. A second impact followed, and then a third, each blow from siege weapons that had been dragged across blasted plains and powered by demonic energies. The adamantium began to warp. The wards inscribed upon the gate flickered and died. From the smoke and dust emerged the enemy, legions of the damned. Horus's chosen warriors led the charge. Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, and the towering forms of chaos-twisted war machines. The air reeked of blood and ozone, of rot and burning metal. The defenders met them with everything they had. Solar Auxilia manned the walls, their lasrifles stitching lines of red through the enemy ranks. Heavy bolters roared, autocannons spat fire, and the sky above became a storm of tracer rounds and falling bodies. In the forefront stood the Legio Custodes, their golden armor dulled by soot, their guardian spears cutting through traitors like wheat. Beside them fought the imperial fists, Dawn's sons, unyielding even as the walls crumbled. Around them, it was not enough. The gate exploded inward in a firestorm of metal and stone. The shock threw defenders from their feet. Through the breach surged the World Eaters, frothing in berserker madness, chain axes screaming. The air became a churning sea of blood, screams, and steel. Valdor himself led the counterattack. His blade, Apollonian spear, flashed with killing light as he carved a path through the enemy, his custodians forming an unbreakable wall around him. Each step forward was bought with lives. The bodies of friend and foe alike carpeted the shattered gateway. High above, Dawn directed the battle with cold precision, shifting squads, sealing smaller breaches and ordering reserves forward. His voice, steady and unshaken, carried over the Vox even as the ground trembled beneath the weight of demon engines pressing the attack. By nightfall, the Lion's Gate was a ruin. The breach could not be repaired. The enemy now had a path into the palace's inner courtyards, and yet it still stood, barely. Dawn descended to the gate himself as darkness fell. He walked among the dead, his expression unreadable. He knew this was only the first of many walls that would fall. The enemy was inside now, and every corridor, every stairway would become a battlefield. But until the last stone of the palace was ground to dust, Rogel Dawn would not yield.